Welcome back to the literature series of the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Janet Poole. Janet is an associate professor as well as a distinguished professor in the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto. And importantly for this podcast, she is also the author of When the Future Disappears, the Modernist Imagination in Late Colonial Korea, which of course I'm going to link below, and which this podcast is going to be based around. And this is why it's so important to get Janet on during this series. She's also the author of a number of other works, which I'm going to link below as well. But what we're focused on today is this unique time in Korean life, as well as Korean literature. This is the late 1930s and the early 1940s, a period after which decades of Japanese rule had been firmly established, and in which it was coming to an end, but no one on the ground could really see this. But the pressure inside literature, inside the stories that people were writing, the censorship and self-censorship that was used and applied, and the languages that people were writing in were not only Korean, but also Chinese and of course Japanese. This is a distinct generation of writers that often knew nothing other than Japanese colonial rule. This was the only world they knew. And deep inside the writing and deep inside their prose are themes like modernization, a fusion of Japanese and Korean cultures, a certain inevitability around the empire, and this strange phenomena where the future wasn't mentioned, or at least not too much, and not too overtly and not too explicitly. Instead, what was represented often was the everyday and subtle themes and looks inside the language that gave away what these people were feeling underneath it all. This is not just an analysis of the period and the writing, but also a look at the writers themselves as individuals and the impacts on their lives and the context in which they wrote, but also the stories as well, translated of course by Janet and invaluable as an insight into the period as well as Korean literature. And I might leave it there for this introduction, because this is not just an incredibly fun podcast for me personally, but complicated and intricate, and I'm not going to be able to do justice to it in this introduction. You're simply going to have to listen to it for yourselves, and listen to Janet both explain her book and this period in detail. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener, and if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or PayPal links attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And all the help in this regard is greatly appreciated. On that, and to walk us through Korean literature in the late colonial period, this is Janet Poole. Janet Poole, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here.
So I've been really hoping to get you on the podcast during this literature series because your book, When the Future Disappears, the Modernist Imagination in Late Colonial Korea, is a real fascinating look, not just at the period, but at Korean literature as well, and the changes that were happening at the time. It's a real insight into the Korean mind and so much more. But before we get started, I might get you to answer a question about how you yourself found yourself in not just Korean studies, but Korean literature studies. What was it that brought you to the field?
Well, I think it was maybe slightly random. I didn't have any deep connection with Korea. I was studying at the University of London at a small school called the School of Oriental and African Studies. I was studying Japanese, and I think that was because I liked learning languages. When I was young, I grew up in rural England, and I think that was my way of kind of traveling in my mind, was learning languages and reading lots of novels and literature. So I think those are the two strands that brought me to Korean literature, because when I was in London learning Japanese, and this was back in the late 1980s, when before the Japanese economy had crashed. So learning Japanese made sense in some way. And there was a professor, Professor Bill Skilland, actually, who I think was the first professor of Korean literature in Europe, or maybe even outside of, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, in England for sure, and in Europe. And it was his last year teaching, and we could study Korean as a kind of special subject. So I took that class, and that's kind of how it began. I was always curious about, I was curious about Korea. The one connection I did have is I was in Amnesty International. My local group, we had a South Korean prisoner. So back in the late 1980s, there were a lot of prisoners of conscience in South Korea. And so I had written letters for this prisoner. I'd heard about South Korea through that connection. I hadn't watched the Olympics, so all I knew about was career through Amnesty. And so when I started learning Korean, for me, it just was natural to turn to literature because I grew up, like I said, escaping through literature and novels. I'm a voracious reader of novels, especially. I read literature from all over the world. So it was just natural for me to go to literature when I started learning a language. So, and then, one thing led to another, and I guess I just kept going. It became my career, which is kind of strange, but yes.
So from that early step, why late colonial literature? Why the focus on that period in particular?
I mean, I think part of it, I think of that in two ways. One is that, like most students in Europe in the late 1980s, we came to Korean studies through either Japan or China, Japanese or Chinese, because there were not Korean studies programs as such like there is today. I think today K-pop brings people into Korean studies, whereas for my generation, we would be studying Chinese or Japanese, and then some interest, or we would meet someone and we would start to study Korean. And I think as a result, we tended to focus on, those areas where Korean history, culture, literature kind of overlapped or encountered other cultures. For me, it was Japanese. And so because I read Japanese, I read Korean, it seemed kind of natural to go to this colonial period when, quite a bit of literature, what we may or may not call Korean literature, was written in the Japanese language. So I think that was one big reason. I think the other reason, is something about being British and growing up in a supposedly post-imperial, I say post in scare quotes, post-imperial society, a society where colonialism has had and still has a kind of deep impression on everyday life. And so it was kind of to think about questions of colonialism and culture, I think kind of stemmed in part from that kind of background as well.
And before we get into the details of the book itself, perhaps I might get to explain just what was the late colonial period and what were the changes happening, so people have a flag post for where we're going and the period we're going to be speaking about.
Sure. I mean, when we say late colonial, there's not an exact date, but we're talking roughly about mid to late 1930s, early 1940s. So Japanese colonial occupation began, formally in 1910, although earlier from 1905, depending on where you want to start, and ended with the collapse of the Japanese Empire in 1945. So late colonial refers to really the period of war, the Asia-Pacific War, kind of the mid-30s after the Manchurian incident in 1931, and then the war started the Second Sino-Japanese War started in 1937, and then eventually the Pacific War. So we're talking about this period of empire at war. So Korea is part of an empire that is at war, and Korea was increasingly mobilized as the war went on. For some very kind of practical reasons, that Korea, once the war broke out in China, Korea was the means to get to China from Japan, the railroads, the material resources were in Korea and were closer to the war front in China. And this meant that Korea was really mobilized for war, and it brought in a series of kind of policies that affected literature in particular. I mean, the fact of being at war and mobilizing soldiers is already had deep effects on the society, but there was a move towards enforcing use of Japanese language, a really harsh censorship of publications, and increasingly moving towards Japanese language publications, although not completely. And I guess the other point that I think is really important for the history of literature is people don't often think about the Japanese Empire as being a virulently anti-communist empire. So there's, from the mid-30s, there's this really violent crackdown on any kind of leftist thought. And in a context where, say, in Korea, Marxist thought was really quite prevalent amongst the intellectuals and writers, that crackdown had a huge impact on literature. So it's a pretty harsh time in many ways. Although I guess I should also add, a time, paradoxically, when the wartime economy kicks in and there's growing cities and a city culture. And so there's a kind of strange kind of commercialization and industrialism that happened at the same time. So the way I think about it is, everything happened in the late period. That's what fascinates me anyway. Yeah.
Well, let's step into your book and the details here. And as a first question on it, and this is, I understand this is going to be a slightly tricky question in some ways. That how did you select the translations, the stories for translation that you chose? As you've written, there was a large proliferation of literature at this time, despite the censorship and despite the difficulty that was going on. So, how did you choose the stories that you included in your anthology?
I think that it's a mixture of stories that kind of spoke to me. I spent 10 years researching this book, and so I was reading a lot of literature from the period, and not just the authors that feature in this book. So as with any research, there's a lot of excess scholar reading that goes into it that doesn't appear in the final product. So I read a lot. That certain kind of stories resonated for me. They still do, and they did from the beginning. So an example would be Chae Myung-ik's story, Walking in the Rain. Yeah, this story, from the very first time I read it, it somehow really resonated with me. I mean, it's a story about, it's quite a simple short story about this guy who walks up and down the road on the edges of the city to go to work. So it's a commuting story, right? An early story of commuting to work. He's commuting to the office on the outskirts of Pyongyang, just as the city of Pyongyang is developing and the city is expanding, and he's really on the outside. He gets to look through the city gates, but not go through them. So he's this kind of in this peripheral, but yet also emergent space, right? That when we look back, we can say, oh, this is the beginning of the suburbs or whatever. But at the time, it was this kind of discarded, yet also kind of dramatically changing place. So there's a kind of dynamism of the dying and the being born, the new that appears in the story. And he meets a photographer. It starts to rain, and he goes inside a photograph studio, meets a photographer, and they start chatting, and that's really all that happens in the story. And it's really, I was just so impressed by the writing in the story. Chae Myung-ik is an amazing portrayer of cityscapes, streetscapes, but also of kind of the psychology of the time. And the photographer, as he describes him, really is this kind of early bourgeois entrepreneur who wants to just make money, get a bigger studio and progress. And the guy who goes into the studio and is talking to him is kind of disgusted by this whole ideology of progress. So in this very kind of small encounter on a few pages, you have two really competing ideologies of modernity coming alive. So for me, that became a very important story, and I ended up starting the book with it. So I would say that for most of the chapters that I have these kind of scenes or stories that really resonated with me for different reasons. And maybe at the end, especially with the last chapter, when you take a look at a manuscript after you've written most of it, there are some things that maybe are clearly missing, you feel you should put in. And so that happened for me with the final chapter, when I felt that I really hadn't dealt with the question of what it meant to write in Japanese. So I kind of actively went out and looked for stories. But otherwise, it's really something that speaks to me. I'm hoping that if it speaks to me, it speaks to readers as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that story there, because it leads into a question, and this is something that I came across while reading through your book. There's a feeling that I kept nagging in the back of my mind that this is the late colonial period, and a period, as you can imagine, of poverty, suffering, and violence. Of course, it's also modernity and such, but the actual representations of colonial life and of the Japanese in it, and Japanese crimes, for example, are not that prevalent. At least it felt like for me that this was a period, of course, of Japanese colonization, but it was the stories of everyday life as well, mostly the stories of everyday life.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And this is one question that's always intrigued me with Korean's colonial literature, is right from the beginning, you're kind of struck by how few, say, Japanese characters appear. There are Japanese characters, and I mean, actual, like not writing characters, but actual characters, peopling stories. There's relatively few, if you know the kind of social history of colonial Korea, we know that there was a huge number of Japanese settlers, and they were living all over the place. There were certainly, settler areas where they were more concentrated than others, but they were also widely dispersed at the same time. So we know that there would have been a lot of, everyday contact between Korean and Japanese settlers. And yet in the stories, a lot of Korean literature, it doesn't appear up front and center. And I find that kind of interesting, because that leads me to think about what literature or fictional space meant at the time, right? And I think it's clearly a space that's being produced that is, I think, certainly not avoiding colonial reality, but is maybe dealing with it often in an indirect way, or it doesn't present colonial life in this kind of colonizer versus colonized binary relationship that historians often narrate. It presents it as a slightly different, world, where Korean characters are dealing with their issues and each other, and they're impacted by colonialism. But it seems like fictional space is not given over to Japanese characters to speak. And I think that tells me something about what literature meant at the time, that I find kind of intriguing, actually.
That actually pushes me to another question as well, and this is the idea of what I suppose was distinct about this generation of writers, because we said it's the late colonial period, but you got to assume that these people had no conception that it was the late colonial period that they were living in. So this is their whole life that they're a part of. So there's really poignant time in Korean and I suppose world history as well, and not realizing it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really great point. And it's really important that, we use the word late colonial, or I use it a lot, but in some way it's very much a retrospective category, right? That we use to talk about something that wasn't experienced as lateness at the time, because I think, people did not know that the Japanese empire was going to collapse, and this was going to be the last few years of the Japanese empire. So that sense of lateness, I think, would not have been experienced as such. What is interesting in terms of the kind of the generational age or demographics of the writers at this time is pretty much all the writers I'm dealing with who became really popular in the mid to late 30s. They were in their 20s. They were quite young. It meant they were born around and about 1910, when the official colonial rule was instigated. So this is the first generation that was actually born in a colony, right? They don't have a lived experience of pre-colonial life. And I think that really is important for thinking about this generation of writers. They've gone through a Japanese colonial education system. Many of them actually then traveled to Japan and went to university or college, but they were already in colonial schools in Korea. And although they would have heard from their parents, of course, and people around them, stories of life before colonial rule, they hadn't directly experienced it. So I think that's a really key experience that unites this generation and impacts their work.
Now, you touched on it a little earlier there. The idea that, of course, as the late colonial period, the Japanese were very keen to impose Japanese culture and Japanese language over the Korean people. So as you were doing the translation, I'm actually wondering about what language the original texts were in. Were they in Hangul, or was there a blend between Japanese and Korean? And was there any Chinese characters involved? I'm interested in I suppose not just the idea that what the original language was, because whatever the original language was would have implications for ideas of Koreanness, I imagine, as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, the kind of written language of colonial period is pretty interesting because it's quite heterogeneous, as most writing systems are. Most fiction by the 30s was written predominantly in Hangul. There weren't that many Chinese characters. Earlier on in the colonial period, there would have been a mixture of Hangul and Chinese characters. But it's kind of interesting that by the mid to late 30s, although Chinese characters are really used in nonfiction work, in newspaper articles and magazine articles, fiction, again, has this interesting kind of focus on Hangul, which I think kind of goes back maybe to the point about what literature is doing in this period. There were increasingly people writing in Japanese, although I should say that from the early colonial period, there were also, people were often writing in, they were very bilingual, so they were writing in Japanese and Korean. So they would often write in both languages. And as you kind of move through especially I think when you get into kind of early 1940s fiction, it's quite interesting in that, you often have characters, say, speaking Japanese within a story, but it'll be written down in Hangul usually. But it's a transcription of Japanese, and the presumption is that the reader knows Japanese as well as Korean, so can follow along. And I guess another issue that's kind of intrigued me, especially as we go into the early 40s, I find that the sentences to me syntactically seem to become, I'm not sure becoming Japanese is the best way to term it, but they kind of lengthen, and the proliferation of subordinate clauses is kind of extreme. And there's a couple of writers I remember reading, and it would just be easier, even though it was in Hangul, to read if I put the sentence into Japanese in terms of word order and subordinate clauses and forms. So there's a real kind of interaction between these languages, right? There's a point where they're not clearly separable, and you see that in the story, which of course is really hard then when you translate into English, because nothing is as hard to translate as bilingual text.
So that's fascinating, the idea that I suppose, Japanese identity and Japanese language was bleeding into Korean prose. Were the Korean writers at the time aware this was happening, do you think?
I think, they were very well educated. They were very well read, reading comfortably in Japanese and Korean. So I'm not sure how conscious it would have been. I mean, at certain points it would be. But I think they were, really well read in Japanese writers, Japanese literature. And so that was kind of part of their identity as writers, I would say. And a lot of them, although they would conceive of certainly think of themselves as Korean. I have no doubt about that. But, there's a kind of almost cosmopolitan identity of writers where they would see themselves as writers, right? As joining the world of literature. And that would be alongside Japanese writers, but also alongside French writers and Russian writers. There's something about the identification with literature that transcends nationality without forgetting nationality, I would say. So I think that kind of heterogeneous linguistic writing would be in some ways a reflection of their lives, right, and their identity.
Another question that you touched on slightly here, every time you speak, I get more and more ideas here, was the idea of modernization. And you mentioned the idea of seeing the world changing rapidly around you and rebelling in some ways, even if it's just an internal dislike of what's happening. And I wonder how this modernization plays out through a lot of the texts that you saw and read and translated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a major theme. I mean, just the kind of dizzying speed of change is a huge theme in colonial literature, and actually on into post-colonial literature too. Modernization doesn't end with the 1930s, but it most definitely saw a big increase in that sense of speeding up of life. I think what David Harvey calls time-space compression, right? This sense that time is speeding up. And that's simply a kind of relative term, right? So if you experience time as speeding up, then it kind of is for you, right? And so when they talk about, the city getting huge from our perspective today, maybe it doesn't seem that big, but for someone then, that was a major change, right? The impact of asphalt, of electricity, and then modern communication and transport, the railway. These were all had huge impacts on people. And the interesting thing is, by the time you get to the kind of mid to late 1930s, you also get that, there was this wave of nostalgia that everyone was talking about. Our age has become so nostalgic in the late 1930s, and it's that kind of nostalgia that arises out of that experience of change, that feeling that something is disappearing and that the world has changed, and we can't go back, or we can only go back through this very conscious effort of writing, whether it be writing stories or performing, supposedly traditional arts or something like that. So I think that late colonial phenomenon of nostalgia and the interest in tradition arises from that sense that the daily life of the world was really changing quite dramatically.
Is it this modernization that also explains what seems to be a mass proliferation of Korean literature at the time? Do you think that's what explains it, or in part, or is it more of a broader cultural phenomena, or is it something perhaps that trauma brings out creativity and literature and expression in people? I'm wondering how you see the rise of literature in its number and its quantity at this time.
Right. I think there's multiple factors, several of which you've mentioned. So I think definitely there becomes the avenue for publication. The kind of material base is important. That there were newspapers and magazines that were becoming profitable because of rising literacy rates. So once we get into the mid-30s, people at the time said that to publish in the 30s, you could make money, whereas in the 20s, publishing was a kind of sacrifice for the nation, right? So there's a commercialization that meant that you could almost make money as a writing. There were a couple who made money as, the first, as maybe not the first, but as professional writers. So there's that access to spaces to publish. So that's definitely part of it. But I think you also make a really good point about what you're saying about trauma and change and this kind of creativity. It really struck me. I mean, when I first began reading Korean stories from this period, it was hard not to be struck by the fact that many of the most famous stories and canonical stories and poems that are celebrated, say, in South Korea today, were actually written in this period where, and the narrative of this period usually is that, Korean culture was suppressed or killed, but we can see that there's also this amazing eruption of creativity. And I think that part of that is coming from, ironically, from the suppression, from the need to find new ways to communicate and to narrate experiences, which colonialism kind of brings on, actually. So again, it's something about what the creative arts or literature can allow people to do. And it might be that they actually become more important and more innovative and more inventive at a time when there seems to be more restrictions on them. And I think that's something that's going on in this period.
And this explosion in publishing, I wonder if it was outpacing in some ways the literacy rates. I wonder what the audience was like, whether there was an audience out there hoping and expecting the next novel to drop, or was this kind of a preempting an audience that was coming just behind them on the wave, so to speak?
I think the readership was getting to the point where publishing could make money, so it became kind of self-sustaining, but also increasing. So the readership figures, I was reading just this morning actually about the, in the mid-30s, the major newspapers began publishing these journals. For instance, Chosun Ilbo was publishing this journal Chobang, which it contained a lot of short fiction, amongst other things. And that was selling out. But I think the first issue sold about 30,000 copies. So those are the kind of numbers we're talking about. But I think 30,000 copies maybe. Also think that these would be shared a lot. Copies would be passed around. So you have a fair readership. It's not everyone in the country. There are many people for whom this would have been irrelevant. But, if we look at publishing figures today for literature, these are not too bad, actually.
Yes.
So I would, I think it's substantial. It's not universal by any means, but it's substantial. And so it allows, writers to dream a bit, people to dream of becoming writers, right, and to communicate in this way. And I think also that connects back to colonialism again, because you've got to think that one kind of major effect that colonialism has on occupied societies is there's, there isn't a kind of public sphere, right, in the sense that there was one university in Korea, but most of the Korean writers ended up going to Japan because it was actually easier to get into universities there than this one elite school in Korea. Obviously, there was limited access to politicians to be in public figures. So actually literature and writers performed a lot of those roles, right, as non-governmental voices that spoke to public issues. So I think literature in that sense was fulfilled that important function in society because there were not other avenues through which people could speak to a larger audience.
So I'd like to ask a question, which is, I know it's a little broad and wide-ranging here, but it does incorporate the title of your book, which is When the Future Disappears. And again, you mentioned it briefly before. That's the idea of time and the sense of time in these stories. And I've seen you write, and you say that the everyday makes this huge appearance of the time, and the characters stop dreaming about the future. And I know you've done a lot of work on this, and a lot of thought into that. So I might get to explain the title of your book and how that sense of time plays out in the stories that you've translated.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The title came at the very end. It took me a while to get there. But actually, the title, the whole time I was writing it, was Unruly Detail. And then I realized at the end that really this idea of the disappearing future was really critical, because I think there are distinctive kind of senses of experiences of time or temporalities in this era that are really productive in the literary art. So when I say the disappearing future, it's not so much that literally the future disappears. It's a sense that other experiences of time come to the fore, and really the sense of the everyday being dominant amongst them. So I guess the way I think about it is, if you look at the kind of longer history of, say, colonial literature in Korea, in the early novels such as by Lee Kwang-soo in the 1910s, which was a really grim, violent time on the Korean Peninsula. Yet the novels seem to have these heroes that kind of go out into the world and dream of changing the world, and there's a kind of hope and belief that structures the stories. Whereas when we get to late colonial period, it's really striking that kind of hope and belief tends to not be that apparent. Another way of thinking about it is that early colonial Korean literature, the characters are often young orphans, young people, who see the future ahead of them. By the time you get to late colonial literature, there's a lot of old people. A lot of characters are like old people who are not really coping with daily life, and that are uncomfortable with the changes going on in society. So it feels like that kind of sense of future prospects becomes far less visible. And there were actually, so for example, the leftist writer and critic Im Hwa, who was really influential at the time, he complained about this. He said that, people are not, dreaming of the future. If you can't think your way to the future or change, from his point of view, how are we going to get to a socialist society, right? If you can't even imagine it in fictional space. And he thought that after the mid-30s suppression of the leftist movement, the writers were no longer writing stories of change and development. They were thinking more about, they appeared to be lacking that kind of sense of future or change. The everyday is interesting for me because I think that there are different ways of thinking about the everyday. So Im Hwa felt that telling stories of everyday life was giving up on politics and belief in change. It was kind of escapism, right? But I'm not really convinced by that argument. And I tried in the writers I focused on to show that in this space of the everyday, so if we think about that first story I mentioned, when Walking in the Rain by Choi Myung-ik, where the main character is walking up and down, commuting to work, right? So the sense of time there, it's repetitive, it's mundane. He walks backwards and forwards every day. It seems like nothing changes. And yet there's kind of an awful lot going on in that story when he's on that walk, right? In terms of how he's thinking about values and how he's understanding his life. So I think that the everyday actually is a very dynamic kind of time. And it was interesting to me that so many stories in this period really focused on that sense of repetitive, mundane, everyday time.
So before we get into a couple of these very specific authors that I found fascinating through their, not just the life stories, but the stories they wrote, I should ask a question about censorship. I'm sure people listening are thinking, this, of course, was a Japanese colonial period. And, of course, it wasn't weakening at the time. There was no real conception that the Japanese Empire was in trouble until the very last few months of it. So I wonder what the censorship was like. Was there any difficulty in publishing? Was there difficulty getting certain themes written? And are there, it is very hard to analyze, but are there notable silences where you're thinking, perhaps the author wanted to write something else, or maybe they're hinting at this through subtle tones?
Right. This is always a big question, especially for colonial literature, but also for later literature under the dictatorships. There was very harsh censorship, but my sense is that it was enacted quite unevenly, as probably most censorships are. So, people have done a lot of work on finding different versions of text, and you can. As a translator too, I do that. Whenever I translate something, I find multiple versions of the text published, say, from the late 30s, early 40s, late 40s, because censorship doesn't stop in 45 by any means whatsoever, right? It's not a purely colonial story. And you find these differences to different degrees in different writers, right? So one thing that interests me is that in the late 40s, when some of these stories are reprinted or novels are republished, the endings have changed completely. So often it's the endings that change. It's hard to, pinpoint what exactly. I guess my approach to that, at least in this book and in my work in general, on the whole, I've been focusing more on what's on the page and trying to work with the silences I see there, trying not to put my own version of what I thought they wanted to say in there, because I think that's, ultimately we don't really know, right? My overall impression is I'm always amazed. I mean, from when I first started reading colonial literature and knowing, that there was such harsh censorship, I'm amazed at what people managed to say, right? And I think some of that was by virtue of writing fiction in Korean, so maybe it was harder to. I think creative writing is harder to censor in general, like literary writing is harder to censor than, say, a newspaper article, because the type of writing is in itself, literary writing tends to be indirect, right? So you can often say a lot more than you can if you're writing a newspaper editorial. So I think that speaks to another reason why literature was popular in colonial period. My sense is that people, it would be hard to come out directly and support the Communist Party. There's certain keywords would most definitely be censored, but still writers manage to get around censorship. I think that's a kind of general rule, right? And it applies to colonial Korea as well.
Well, let's step into some of the writers. And the one that I found most fascinating was Cho Jae-seo, which is this Korean writer who at some point really embraces the Japanese Empire, and he does so for interesting reasons. So he writes things like, you must die for the empire. So he's not fudging his words here when he changes, but he changes from this champion of Korean literature to a champion of Japanese literature at this period. And he says things like, I always realized that I was Japanese. And he even says that the death of his son pushed him into Japanese colonial literature. So he, for me, becomes this fascinating character of why this shift and how we should look at this change. And so I'll stop rambling on here, but how should we look at his work and the character there?
Yeah, I share your fascination with him. So he was one of the figures who was added later when I looked at what was missing from my list of favorite stories. And I realized that I was focusing so much on the kind of everyday, kind of murky, politically murky realm of the everyday, and I didn't have someone who was really coming out and openly espousing fascism, and I felt I needed to think about that, right? And so I went to Cho Jae-seo because he's kind of notorious at this point. After Lee Kwang-soo, he's probably the second most notorious collaborator, because he did, he there's no denying he asked young Korean students to go and fight in the war. He promoted Japanese language very openly. So there's no denying that he did a lot of things that are really, I think in many ways reprehensible. But I found I do find him very, I have 2 points I guess I'd like to make. One is that I think it's important to understand the logic of that fascism, that we can't just, we don't gain by just dismissing it as somehow illogical or irrational. And so reading through his essays, you could start to see points at which it made sense. He could start to make sense of not just Japanese colonialism, but the particular version of kind of wartime imperialism, the way in which he saw it as somehow resolving the messiness of modernity. I think he felt modernity was very messy, and he wanted to kind of clear it up. And I think that desire for clarity and simplicity is also part of a kind of fascist mentality that he displays, and that I think can make sense to us, right? Without us condoning it, it makes sense. So that's important. The other reason I still am actually really fascinated by him, and I've been thinking a lot about what happened to him afterwards, because he's the only person I wrote about who didn't go to North Korea. So, and ironically, he had the longest future, right? Because everyone else got executed. So the irony, right, is that whose future did not disappear, even though in another way it kind of did, because, he bought into the Japanese project, and then boom, Korea was no longer part of Japan. So there's a real interesting irony there. But I find it very poignant that what you mentioned, where he writes about his young child dying, and somehow this project of writing in Japanese can replace that. That tells me that there's something, not trivial, but very emotionally significant in his kind of dedication to what he thought Japanese language and literature could bring him. And it's interesting because he was so important in the earlier years in promoting Korean modernist writers, and these writers he was their early champion, and a brilliant literary critic, I should say. I mean, the man was quite brilliant. And he really supported those mid-30s experiments in writing in Hangul. So I don't think he's, I think that for him, it's not so much about giving up Korea or Korean. When he says, I felt, I always had felt very close to Japan or being Japanese, it doesn't necessarily exclude being Korean. I think that kind of subjectivity is a really complex one, where he could hold these things together somehow in his head. So yeah, he's a really fascinating figure, I would say.
Well, let me ask another question based on what you just said there. It was really interesting. You said the idea he wants a clearer future. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting thought, because we have this image looking back that you're suffering colonization and it should all be about struggle. But of course, we're not there, and this is hindsight. And this struggle, this constant fighting for your own identity, your Koreanness, can become exhausting. And perhaps we don't give enough credit today, looking back, on how attractive accepting the colonization and accepting perhaps a peace that comes with it, and how attractive this may have been for many Koreans, especially many elite Koreans.
Yes. Yeah, I think exactly. You're right to point to the kind of class basis of this, because I think there was, the potential, or dreamed of potential, of becoming Japanese for an elite Korean could maybe relieve you of that burden of being colonized, right? Which was a burden. I mean, Che Jae-seol called it what fighting sumo with a shadow or something like that. I think I've got the wrong metaphor there, but still. But anyway, this sense of not being kind of sense of, as a cosmopolitan literary intellectual, which he definitely is, right? He was a great scholar of Shakespeare, by the way. He translated Shakespeare into Korean, and that's what he's really well known for today, or his translations of Macbeth and Hamlet and the tragedies. As a kind of someone who aspired to such a kind of cosmopolitan intellectual world, being a colonized subject felt like, I think, a hindrance or a burden, right? And he did have the possibility, because of his connections, his linguistic abilities, the circles he moved in, of kind of shedding that from time to time. And I think you're right. I think that could be, psychologically liberating in a way. Although, of course, it also comes with its own burden. Right? A bit of a vicious circle, but I think you're right that we have to remember, and especially in a circumstance where maybe the end of colonialism was not very imaginable or didn't seem imminent, then the question of how you get on in your life, right, would be important. And so I can kind of understand his logic in some ways. While also finding, obviously, some of the blind spots are just kind of shocking, right? There's no doubt about that.
So let's step into another author, and again, a topic that was briefly brought up before, and this is So-In-Sik, and you mentioned nostalgia and the place that nostalgia was being felt. And there's this three stages: feudal, modern, and decadent nostalgia. Mm-hmm. And I suppose we should introduce what decadent nostalgia was, and who So-In-Sik was, and what his writing is about and like.
Sure. I mean, So-In-Sik became really important to me. He was a Marxist philosopher. He'd studied, he'd been in the Communist Party. He'd been in prison for 5 years in the early 1930s. And then he'd also studied philosophy in Japan. And when he came out of prison, he began writing profusely. I mean, really, he's written hundreds of pages of articles and a book and literary and cultural criticism. He wrote some serious philosophical works, but also more maybe popular works thinking about Korean society at the time. So he's usually, he's not known often, and I think this doesn't really do him justice. He's known as one of those communists who went to prison and then recanted and came out supporting Japanese imperialism. I don't really agree with that reading of him. I think that, I guess the reason he's sort of is such a collaborative by some people is that in many of his writing, he did introduce the writing of Japanese Kyoto school philosophers who were very much associated with the Japanese wartime ideology. And he is one of the major figures who introduced their thought in the Korean language. But what intrigued me was that in all of his writing, he kind of introduces these writers, but then there's always like a final page or two of the essay where you feel like he's suddenly coming out and saying what he really wants to say. So this is an example of, I think, one of those ways of working around censorship is, in the last paragraph, you suddenly say, well, but does any of this make sense? And he literally does that. So I find him very fascinating for that reason, that he found a way, at the heart of what seems to be the most imperial ideological space to raise questions about that ideology. So that's one aspect of him that interested me. He also is one of the writers, like you mentioned, who actually theorized the phenomenon of nostalgia at the time. And many people, he wasn't the first to notice that nostalgia was somehow rampant in this time. But he did write a couple of really intriguing essays about nostalgia, where he was trying to understand it as a kind of socio-historical problem, and he does that by a kind of taxonomy of nostalgias at the time, because which I think is really helpful to us, because he pluralizes these nostalgias and tries to think about what their different dynamics are, though. So he doesn't want to homogenize this phenomenon and thought at the time. So he has the feudal, sorry, I was getting his own taxonomy. The feudal has this tripartite distinction between the feudal, the modernist, and the decadent nostalgia. So briefly, the feudal would be the kind of nostalgia that someone like Imhua hated. It would be the writer who loves traditional things and wants to restore them in the present, right? In that sense, it's feudal, and this kind of dream of returning to a past and resurrecting it in the present. The modernist nostalgia. He pointed to the generation I spoke of earlier, who were born around the 1910s, who'd kind of grown up, within modern society and education and modern thought, and had been really kind of dedicated modernists, but were now finding themselves living in a time where that sense of hope and progress had gone, or seemed to have disappeared. And therefore they were nostalgic about their own youth. So they're not nostalgic about a traditional career, but they're nostalgic about the kind of dreams of hope and progress which they associated with their youth. So examples of this for him were often the early Marxists who had recanted and were nostalgic about that earlier time when they believed that revolution was possible and that things could change, and they weren't believing that anymore. But then the final nostalgia which he dwells on is this idea of decadence and a decadent nostalgia, which is really where his own, I think, interests lie as a source of a resource for political potential. So the decadent nostalgia, he said, was this kind of new phenomenon that arose from the writers who'd never really who'd never known pre-colonial life, so could not really be nostalgic about this traditional career, or refused to be nostalgic about some notion of tradition and nation. And had not lived through that kind of dreams of the future and of the early modern period. So we're not really nostalgic about their youth, but had a really kind of unsettled and uneasy relationship with their present. So it's a kind of decadence in that it negates, or it rejects tradition. It rejects modernism, and it kind of is rejecting the kind of status quo at the time. It's not necessarily proposing some other alternative, right? But I think for him, in the context of the moment, that kind of sense of decadence, of negation, of irony, and paradox is what he saw as what was kind of possible in the moment. And it kind of, I think, he embodies that in his own philosophical practice, where he introduces these philosophers and then does his final page where he kind of says what he wants, or there's one where he says, well, can Japan really create this new society? And it's just left as a question. So he doesn't fill in the blanks, right? But he raises the question. And I think that's what the decadent nostalgic does. And that's where Soren Schick aligned himself. So I think it's a kind of really dynamic, I think, aspect of intellectual life in this period.
So from that question of nostalgia, that at least it points us towards the last author that I'm going to introduce, which is Lee Tae-jun, and this is A really interesting one because his writing, you say he's an antiquarian. Now, I never heard of that term before. And but of course, it's someone who is fascinated by antiques. And a lot of his writing, he is sitting around, surrounded by antiques, writing about antiques. And you begin to think to yourself, what is the interest factor here? And then you begin to realize there's this recurring character, the old man. And what he's really doing is through connecting with this oldness around him, he's seeking his own identity, it seems, and perhaps even a Korean identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm kind of personally fascinated by antiquarians because it's easy to dismiss them. The antiquarian, they're usually collectors. They seem to be, disconnected from the world somehow. But I think antiquarians are really interesting figures in terms of the way in which they think about history. There was quite a rise in antiquarianism in colonial Korea, and Lee Tae-jung was one figure, not the only one by far. There were quite a few of them. But yeah, you're right. He was fascinated by antiques, and he would sit in his study at night talking to them. He writes, and you might think he's crazy, but it's this really to me, interesting, kind of expansive space that opens up, right? In the way he describes himself late at night in his room, in the dark, with his orchid, with his antique, talking to them. Yes, you can call it escapism, but it's also a kind of production of a certain kind of space and sense of selfhood. That may or may not be national. I mean, I think it has some, in some ways, the nation is appropriated for that personal space. Because I find there's something very kind of bourgeois about it, right? Obviously, first of all, the material resources that are demanded to enable this life are quite substantial. Yeah, I find in some ways Lee Tae-jung then it embodies some of the biggest political ambiguities of or impasses of this period, right? And that he wants to imagine this other world, but the only way he can imagine it is late at night in his study on his own. It's a deeply solitary individual, maybe individualist activity, actually. So in that sense, it's very modern, right? That's what interests me, is the way in which the kind of idea of tradition comes together with a very modern individualist practice, right? And it's very romantic, with capital R, very kind of romantic thought. So I came to Lee Tae-jung very early. He was one of the first writers, and I still grapple with him. I've translated a lot of his work, so I'm very kind of intrigued by the paradoxes that he embodies.
So as a final couple of questions here, you mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast, just in passing, that a lot of these writers at the end of the colonial period, they went to North Korea by choice and lived up there. Of course, Cho Chae-so excluded from this. So this is an interesting phenomenon, why so many of them chose the North over the South. So why do you think that was? And do we have any record of what happened to them? I have to assume that over time they didn't meet particularly good ends.
Yeah, exactly. This is what I'm actually working on at the moment for a new book. They didn't. And I think it's interesting. All of the writers, except for Choi Jae-seo, right, did choose to go to the North. In the case of Choi Myung-ik, he already lived there, so he stayed in the North. But the others, even Lee Tae-jung, went North. And people find that perplexing. I think most people understand why, the revolutionaries who were in colonial prisons went North. That makes sense to us from our current point of view, right? We can understand that. It's much harder to imagine why someone like Lee Tae-jung, he sat in a room talking to orchids all night. Why would he choose to go to North, what was to become North Korea? I think at the time, it tells us that at the time he went in 1946. So, and actually over the course of the late 40s is where I would say almost the majority of modernist writers and artists did cross over to the northern side. I think they saw that as a more viable future in many ways, maybe for them personally, but for their art. I think someone like Lee Tae-jun, when you read his stories from the late 40s, he's really still disgusted by the commercialism and rampant corruption that is going on in what became South Korea. And maybe he sees that, or for him at that time, in that moment, there's more viability in having the kind of literary world he wanted on the northern side. Of course, that didn't come to pass, and unfortunately, many of these writers came to pretty sad endings. So Lee Tae-jun, we still don't really know. He was purged in 1953. He became so at the end of the Korean War. A lot of these writers were purged. Some, such as Im Hwa and Kim Nam-chong, were executed. Others, such as Lee Tae-jun, were, heavily critiqued as bourgeois reactionaries, right? Which he was, right? There was plenty of proof. So he actually deny that, right? His bourgeois past, because that's his whole work. He was, we think, sent into internal exile. And I think people don't really know when he died. In recent years, some of the endings or when these writers died has been coming to light, but it's still a little murky and unreliable, a lot of the information we have. So that's why if you read a book on colonial writers, you'll see that their birth dates are there in parentheses, but more often than not, there's a question mark for the death date because nobody actually knows quite what happened. But yeah, it's to me, it's intriguing, but also, it's kind of the tragedy of this, right? The move north in dream of a better life, definitely, with the dream of a future that ironically then it didn't happen, but no one could see that at the time, right? No one knew that Korea would still be divided. And they certainly didn't know when they went north what was going to happen to them. And maybe they wouldn't have fared better in the south. So it's this kind of late 40s, it's this interesting, moment where the kind of division of states that we're so familiar with today is much more in flux. And people are making choices that are without knowing what's going to happen. Obviously, we always do. We don't know what the future will be, right, when we make our life decisions. So that it is one of the kind of tragedies of Korean literary history that so many of these writers did end up exiled or executed or just disappearing, right, or not writing again, right? We don't know what happened to them.
So, as a final question, I find your translation of this period fascinating. I'm sure you do too, and everyone who's read your book, of course. And this is really an interesting period. But I wonder how South Koreans see it looking back, or what your feel is for how South Koreans see this period, because it's a question in my mind of, I suppose it ties together some of those questions of modernization and Koreanness and what it means. So when Koreans look back at the literature of this period, are they interested? I wonder how they see it, or is it perhaps bringing up uncomfortable memories and uncomfortable period in their life, and perhaps a realization that many Koreans were collaborators or perhaps accepted aspects of Japanese life that they don't want to think about today. So I wonder about that question of how Koreans may look back on the literature of this period.
I think it's a very complicated issue to look back on this, because you're right, there's a deep discomfort with the kind of collaborative actions of the time. I think deep regrets about the way this period of time, what happened at the larger kind of national level historically. And there's a lot of kind of, ugly secrets that come to light the minute you start researching this period. And obviously that can have very material results, right? It's, the nuances and conflicts and paradoxes that I find fascinating, might not be so fascinating if you were the descendant of one of these figures who'd, either disappeared to North Korea and therefore you had suffered discrimination in the South over the years, or your family had been disgraced, or, you were a descendant of someone who'd been a prime collaborator who maybe had materially done okay afterwards, but yet, you're, I guess, associated in some sense with that history, right? I think that's a very uneasy relationship to have. So, yes, I think that there's while many of these stories are loved and remembered, stories from this period, some of them are in high school textbooks, maybe not so much the ones I wrote about, but stories from this period are the source of the modern canon and are in high school textbooks. The ones where maybe it's easier to not confront the history when you read them. I think that there's that kind of celebration of some of those stories, but also a desire to forget, which I think is understandable. But, as time goes on, I think, certainly turning the millennium into 2000 in terms of scholarly research in Korea, there was such a amazing rethink of this period and huge amounts of historical work has been done. And there's the kind of study of colonial history was really came to the fore. And so there's plenty of scholars in Korea who are willing to confront these questions, right? And clearly fascinated by them too. So there's this mixture of the kind of popular version of this period, right? And yet the kind of fascination of scholars and historians in the period. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. But, ultimately, and it's like if you're British too, you have a history, right? You can't disclaim the history. And history has some pretty ugly things in it, right? And so that's the kind of aftermath of colonial rule is working through some of those. And I think on the whole, it's better to try to work it through rather than silence it.
So that's a great thoughtful note to end the podcast on. Janet's book, which I've been using for research for the podcast today, is called When the Future Disappears, The Modernist Imagination in Late Colonial Korea. And that's going to be linked below the podcast, of course, for people that want to go and read it for themselves. I can't recommend it enough. And of course, Janet has just piqued my own interest again with as a hint at a new book, and I can't wait to see that come out as well. So on that, Janet Poole, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming on the Korean Art Podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been great. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korean Art Podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.